You're listening to Radio Omnicor, the podcast where data meets heart. I'm Colleen McClintock, your host, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Hilton Rudnick. Today, we're exploring one of the most overlooked yet powerful skills in leadership, listening. Our guest is Oscar Trimboli, author, speaker, and mentor, whose life's work is dedicated to helping leaders and teams listen beyond the words. He's the host of the award-winning Deep Listening podcast, has spoken with audiences around the world, and is the author of How to Listen, Discover the Hidden Key to Better Communication. This episode is a little different. Instead of shaping the questions ourselves, we started by listening first, inviting our community to share what they had most wanted to know about listening in the workplace and in life. Together, we'll explore how to listen when emotions run high, when interruption can deepen understanding, and how leaders can model present listening in their teams. And now, here's our conversation with Oscar. Welcome, Oscar and Hilton, into the studio. It is very exciting to be here for episode 60. Lovely to have you here, Oscar.
Looking forward to listening to your questions.
Great. And hi, Hilton.
Hi everyone. Excited to be interrogating Oscar.
Okay, we'll see how that goes. Oscar, before we jump into your frameworks and your wisdom, I'm just fascinated to hear a bit about how you landed in this world of becoming the listening guru. Was there a moment in time where you had this epiphany, or how did you land up in this very important work?
You have to go back to April 2008. I'm in a boardroom and I'm in Sydney, and we've got people on a video conference to Seattle and Singapore, and it's the annual budget setting process at Microsoft. There I'm a marketing director, and this meeting typically goes for about 90 minutes, and there's 17 people on each of those different locations. And we have to get the budget sorted out for the year. And 20 minutes into the discussion, my boss, the vice president of the region, says to me, "Oscar, we need to speak immediately after the meeting." I did not listen to a word anybody said for the rest of the meeting. All I did was took out a pen and a piece of paper, because I figured it would be a little less distracting than typing it into a spreadsheet. But I was trying to work out how many weeks of salary have I got left, and who are the 5 people I need to call to find paid work after the honey we need to talk conversation from Tracy. Meeting finishes about 70 minutes. So it's about 20 minutes early, which is kind of unusual for the budget setting meeting, which usually goes well over. And as everybody left the room, I tried to avoid a stay of execution and made my way out with everybody else. And Tracy said, "Oscar, please close the door, because what I have to say is very important." I closed the door, started to walk back towards the boardroom, and about halfway back to the chair, Tracy says to me, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you?" And I thought, oh, great, I'm getting fired and I don't even know what I did. I sat down. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Oscar, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world." What I heard was, "Woohoo, I've still got a job." I have no idea what code listening meant. And the only thing I could blurt out in that moment was, "Tracy, do you mean code or code?" Which was my way of saying, "Do you want it in software or something else?" And she says, "Code, Oscar, we work at Microsoft." Walked out the door, didn't think another thing of what Tracy said till about 2 weeks later, when the Chief Financial Officer, Brian, came to me and said, "Oscar, can you come to my team meeting and audit my listening?" I said, "Oh God, Brian, you've been talking to Tracy about this listening caper, haven't you?" I said, "Honestly, I didn't pay attention after the 20-minute mark, and I've got this huge gap in my revenue because I wasn't in the fight. And Brian said those magic words that everybody who carries a revenue target wants to hear from their finance leader. Oscar, can't change your top line budget, but we can look at investment to help you to grow. I said, great, Brian, where's this meeting? What time? And what do you want me to do? And I sat in Brian's finance meeting 2 weeks later and started to jot down what Brian was doing when he was listening. And I realized as I was writing this down on a piece of paper, I was starting the process of coding how other people listen. Well, since then, 2008 to today, that's all I've been doing is figuring out how the best listeners in the world listen. We've done deep dive interviews with judges, journalists, hostage negotiators. We've got a database of 35,000 people who've told us what gets in their way when it comes to listening, got jigsaw puzzles and books and all kinds of artifacts to help people improve their listening in the workplace. So, from a moment where I thought I'd get fired, I guess if you're a leader out there, what you say and what they hear may be two completely different things, unless you get the opportunity to clarify, which Tracy did.
Thank you, Tracy, for allowing that to happen. And today's format is really interesting. You guided us, Oscar, to do something, a bit of an experiment with our episode, which was we reached out to the community, actually, and we asked them, what are the questions they would like you to answer? So we're going to move through some of those questions, and I'll kick off with one being, when is it okay to interrupt someone in a conversation? How do you handle being interrupted? And that's from Greg Fabish.
Happy to answer the questions, but what I'm curious from Hilton and Colleen's perspective is listening happens before, during, and after the discussion. What did you learn from the process of listening to your audience before we got together?
I think it was fascinating for me because it gave me a different perspective as to what value do people want to get out the episode. So typically, Hilton and I have the privilege of sitting in front of the guest and, learning what we can from them. So it was very different to a lot of the things possibly that I would have answered. So it was a very interesting exercise, and just the people being part of it really enjoyed being involved and, are excited to hear the episode. So that was also a bit about change management and getting some collaboration going. So everyone's very hyped now to hear it. So that was also interesting.
And from your perspective, Hilton?
So, Oscar, what I found in my life is that I have multiple modes of listening. I would consider myself a bad listener, but I trained to be a therapist. And during that time, we spent months really just learning how to listen, how to question, how to reflect. And I can switch that on when I'm in that mode. Then I can be an excellent listener. I can, really just cross the bridge, be in the other person's world, not in my own head, and just focused on what they're saying and, be able to really get into a dialogue with them. When I'm at home, when my guard's down, when I'm not in that mode, I just think it's a completely different story. And I think I've got a lot to grow in that area. So I really have to switch it on to be able to be in the mode. So in a conversation like we're having now, I'm switched on. But I'm not always like that.
But was there anything in the process of getting these questions in advance that surprised you or created a new perspective?
So, I think what I've kind of felt for a long time is that, listening is so fundamental to life. It's whatever. Our lives are built through relationships. We talk the whole time. We make a living out of talking. We make a living out of being in meetings by doing those things. Yet it's I would say that most people just don't have the foundations of doing this. It's not something we learn as children. It's not something that's ever formally kind of, we inducted into that world of how to do it. And I am surprised, well, not surprised, but I'm used to the fact that most people are poor listeners and their heads are somewhere else when you're talking. And exactly what you were saying, your message and what people receive can be worlds apart. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried.
I think for those of you who are listening right now, we will get to Greg's question, and I'm not trying to create time for me to think. The importance that is placed on listening in the moment is where the focus of most literature is. Yet the reality is, in workplace conversations, we need to create a platform and a process advance of the meeting. So listening happens before, during, and after the conversation. If you think listening can't happen after the conversation, because a lot of people say to me, Oscar, how can I listen after the conversation? Just don't take any of the to-dos out of your meeting and do nothing with them and see what happens. Most people think you're not listening to them. And this is mirrored in employee engagement surveys where everybody's surveyed, but it's never regularly communicated back with an action plan. So after the fact of listening to employees, people don't feel heard. That's why we have to have balloons and cakes to get people to fill in forms and have a tracker and cheer every time somebody goes past a big 50%, 60% milestone. So the first thing we would say that we've learned from great global listeners is they get ready for the conversation and they get the others ready for the conversation as well. So something before the meeting, whether that's a group meeting or a one-on-one, some version of what will make this a good conversation. Because this is your permission slip to interrupt. So if we come into a conversation, a lot of people say to me, hey, Oscar, interrupting's bad listening. And I was like, no, it's not. There is a time for interruption and there is also time for silence as well. So when it comes to interruption, here's a few don'ts and here's a few do's. Don't interrupt someone mid-thought, mid-breath, or mid-sentence. They feel like you've cut them off. So at least allow them to finish the thought, the sentence, the breath. To professionally and skillfully interrupt, you need that permission slip that says something like, Colleen, at the beginning of the conversation, you said this would make this a good conversation. Just checking in with you right now. Are we on track, or some version of calibrating what the initial agreement was? In a team meeting, that might be just going around the room at the beginning of a team meeting, whether that's physical or virtual, and ask everybody, look, in one sentence, what do you want to get out of today? And we don't do that for the host. Good hosts get everybody to listen to the active speaker, but great hosts get everybody to listen to each other. So it gives everyone a chance to go, oh, okay, so Greg wants this out of the meeting. And in case something comes up and maybe he wasn't paying attention, I can jump in for him, or I can ask him to clarify what that means. So back to interruption, don't do it mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-breath. Do interrupt if the person is going in a very circular, spiraling way that's either off the agreed purpose, off the agenda, or not serving the purpose of the conversation or the purpose of the gathering. So that might sound like, thanks, Greg. You mentioned that. Could you put it into one sentence to get them to make some kind of concise approach to that? Well, Greg, if that was a subject line in an email, what would the subject line look like? And you're using this technique to get them to concision, to get them as concise as possible. So you move from content and context to what they really mean. And once they can explore their own meaning, they might even come to their own insight. They'll use words like, yeah, actually what I should have said was, or what I meant to say was. So they'll give you all these code words ahead of time. And I can see Hilton nodding. You've heard those code words by the sounds of it, Hilton. So if they're going in a downward spiral, if they're getting repetitive, if it's off track, that's the moment to use a skillful, professional, and courteous interruption, not a cutoff. There's a big difference between a skillful interruption and a cutoff. So before we move on to the second question, which is, I believe, how do you deal with the situation when someone interrupts you? Is there anything else you wanted to explore on that question on Greg's behalf that maybe needs amplification or concision?
I wanted to ask the impact of interruption. In other words, if you are cutting mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-sentence, and you've said the person feels very cut off, what is the emotional impact on the conversation then?
What we hear from our research and what the speaker says when they're not listened to in that cut-off way, I feel like my opinion's not valued. I don't want to speak up. I feel smaller is an interesting phrase we see in the verbatims. And it's pointless speaking up if I'm going to get cut off. Now, if you're in a highly complex, safety-orientated or highly regulated environment, not speaking up has some huge consequences. It could have consequences with a regulator. It could have lethal consequences in manufacturing facilities, construction sites, mining sites. So the impact of a cutoff interruption as opposed to a skillful, elegant, professional cutoff means you're not going to hear the issues that are holding the system back. You will hear peripheral or symptomatic issues, but you won't hear systemic issues because people aren't confident, comfortable, or feel like they can risk something professionally to say what needs to be said. The commercial implications of that, projects that run over schedule, projects that run over budget, poor quality outcomes, customer leakage, meaning customers go to competitors, employees that leave and go to other organizations. So be careful. Interruption that's a cutoff done repetitively and in a pattern will basically stifle what you hear from the organization.
So Oscar, I mean, I think in some way you're talking about the art of conversation, and it's a very sophisticated give and take between people. And like, I know I'm drawn to concise speakers, to people who can just in a nutshell say what they want to say, but I'm a rambler. I can, say the same thing several times, and it irritates me when other people are doing it. But I would find it difficult in a conversation to frame it for someone. So like to Colleen's point, I wouldn't want them to feel that I'm shutting them down. I want them to speak, but I want them to speak in a different way where they can just get to the nutshell of the message and know for sure that when they've said it the first time, I've got it, that they don't have to say it in multiple ways for me to get it. So, but it sounds very artful to be able to do that diplomatically, to wait for the right moment and to kind of intervene in a way that, helps the person talk in a way that is going to get better throughput in the conversation, a better dialogue rather than a lecture or whatever might be going on. So those skills that you're talking about, for me, seem like most people don't have them, in kind of channeling the conversation to work more optimally. Do you find that you have to train people to do that, or just by planting the seed like you're doing, that people can just do it?
I think where we make the biggest impact when we train people here, Hilton, is knowing these three numbers. So we've talked a little bit about art. Now let's talk a lot more about science. When people know these three numbers, it's the thing that people comment most back. When you get this insight, it shifts your perspective on the how of listening versus the what of listening. So the how would be, any kind of conversation that you're saying, rambling frustrates you. Well, let's explain why. Humans on average can speak between 125 to 150 words a minute. I typically speak towards 100 to 125, slightly slower and deliberately so to emphasize a point, but we'll get back to that shortly. So if you're selling real estate or at a cattle yard auctioneer or calling a horse race, you can speak at 200 words per minute and it's fine. You can hear me at 200 words per minute because you turn your YouTube on and your audio books, and you can still have complete comprehension. If the context is similar to what you're used to, the language is similar to what you're used to as well. If jargon's involved, maybe you've got to dial it back a bit. That's from the listener's perspective, though. Here's what's going on for the speaker. The speaker, on average, has 900 words per minute in their head. They can only say 125 to 150 on average. So that means the first thing they say is 14% of what they think. Said another way, they haven't said 86% of what they're thinking. That's the average. The range is between 600 and 1,600 words per minute. So some people are way off the scale thinking at 1,600 words per minute. So that number is down to 3% of what they're thinking is coming out of their mouth. And they tend to be the ramblers, by the way. Now, once you know this, you may set up your mindset in a slightly different way to think about the use of silence, the use of much shorter questions. So on average, questions of 8 words or more are difficult for adults to comprehend. So shortening your questions will have a bigger impact for the person you're in dialogue with. So Hilton, the reason why some people ramble is that may be the very first time they say it. And they've been thinking about it like a clothes washing machine that's dirty and it's sudsy and it's agitated and it's just going around, but they're not making any progress until the rinse cycle, which is them speaking. But when they speak the first time, it's a ramble. We can pick up patterns pretty quickly. We can pick it up from email. We can pick it up from the initial discussion. People either tend to talk in stories or data. Big picture, detail. The people who spend their time in detail probably better at concision. The people who are at data are probably more specific. The people who are big picture and storytellers, they're probably the people you mentioned earlier, Ron, about rambling. And therefore, I would encourage you to feel comfortable and confident that goes, hey, if I'm anticipating one of these people, grab that permission slip early on in the conversation. What will make this a good conversation? Not what do you want to get out of it, because they'll tell you every conversation is a speaker and a listener, and those positions change and they're simultaneous. And in group meetings, that's even worse. So you've got 6 people thinking at 900 words per minute, watching the meeting going on, trying to figure out what they say. So as a mathematical puzzle, it's quite complex. I want everyone to feel comfortable in using a muscle around interruption that's going to advance the conversation, not just your point of view or not just your outcome, but the outcome of the group of you or the 2 people in dialogue together. How quick are you, Hilton, at kind of diagnosing, are they a rambler versus they're pretty sharp and to the point?
I mean, I think I make a very quick judgment around that. Yeah, because as soon as someone starts repeating themselves or just, rephrasing something that they've already said, and I've got the message, normally I want to respond at that point. And they're still, going on about the same thing. So yeah, I think I make a quick judgment, maybe too quick, around whether someone is a rambler.
And for you, Colleen, have you got a heuristic that you use to kind of calibrate how you're going to be in dialogue with someone based on their communication preference?
I don't think I get as triggered or impatient when people are talking. So probably go more with the flow, but referring back to your conversations in teams and in meetings, that's when I do find I love your idea of the permission slip and contracting up front, because facilitating the conversation so that it's done in time and everyone's had an opportunity to speak. I find myself wanting to wrap things up because of that.
Yeah. And when we did these deep dive interviews with these world-class listeners, whether they're judges, journalists, or hostage negotiators, or air traffic controllers, that what set them apart from people in our database was, on average, they spend not a lot of time, but they actually spend a little bit of time in dialogue at the beginning about the how, not just the what. So the agenda is the what, how are we going to discuss it? So a simple thing in team meetings, so we're going to hear from everybody, or we only going to hear from subject matter experts? Has the group agreed that protocol or not? Because the first discussion should be that. Or decision making in a group of 6, there's an even number as an example. How do we make decisions? Is it majority plus 1? Is the leader of the team get an overriding vote? Discussing how you're going to make a decision, discussing how you're going to have the conversation requires about 5% of the time up front to make it very productive. If you don't, what happens is people don't contribute, people have meetings after the meetings, people come back the following meeting with deliverables that weren't agreed or weren't the same as what everybody else said. And there's a massive productivity impact, which impacts profitability and timelines and quality for the organization that they're part of. So spending a small bit of time. If you're a leader who's starting off with a new team, maybe you've been promoted, maybe you've been transferred, maybe you're just joining the organization, I would strongly encourage you to think about, how does the team have the conversation? And the same is true in the one-on-ones with the team that you're leading. Think about how this could be a good use of their time, how could it be good use of your time, and how could it be good use of the organization's time, and just discuss that. Back to Tracy, way back, I think this was 2005, Tracy had this big intergalactic job, very difficult, managing a team of over 1,000, and I got promoted into a team, and I simply said when I started, Tracy, what's the best way to communicate with you? She goes, don't send me email. I won't action it on that day. I'll look at my email at the end of the day. If you need to talk to me or communicate or require a decision, send me a text. Now, I rarely use that, but we had the conversation about that. So did I get frustrated that I sent a message on email that she didn't reply to? No, because we'd already discussed that. But too many of us don't have the opportunity to do that, or choose consciously not to do that as well. That liberated me, because then I went back to my team and I said, this is the way I prefer to be communicated with. These were the ways my team interacted with me. And that made my day much simpler, because people on my direct team knew how to communicate with me. If you're listening right now, how well does your team, or how well does your leader know how to communicate with you? Have you had an explicit and overt conversation about it? If you have, great. How are you going? Sustaining that? That'd be an interesting question too.
Well, I think that's a bit of a segue into the question that I have. So Oscar, Hilton and I have got some of the questions we're each going to be asking you. And this question is from Amelia Fox, and she asks, how do I as a leader help my team build listening skills? What can I do to help build those skills in my team and continue to support growth and reinforcement in that area?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is do what Tracy did. What I did in that team meeting, I did in many other environments, but it was Tracy who noticed it. Tracy who took the time. It was literally 3 minutes at the end of the meeting, not a lot of time, to help me know the impact of what I did at the 20-minute mark. Are you taking the time to celebrate great listening? And are you taking the time to help team members when they're not listening? Unfortunately, you're already teaching your team how to listen because you're role modeling listening to them. So Hilton mentioned earlier on, we're not trained as children on how to listen. We're not, sorry, he said formally trained. Sorry, Hilton, don't want to verbal you there. And this is true. As children, we learnt to listen from our parents' example, our aunties and uncles and our grandparents and those around us that we looked up to. So don't underestimate the role modeling you do as a leader when it comes to listening. One of the simplest things to do, again, is in team meetings, is to notice who hasn't spoken. And sometimes when we rush, because we've got a 15-minute section on this agenda and we really want to get through it and we've got a decision, but 3 out of the 6 people haven't even spoken on this decision. Have you really got a decision? Or have you got 3 hostages and 3 people who've agreed to move forward? Take that little bit of extra time to hear from others. Once you start to do that, you'll notice that when the baton moves on, your team will start to say that. You will have been successful as a listening leader when your team members say, we haven't heard from Colleen yet. We haven't heard from Pam yet. We haven't heard from Brian yet. We haven't heard from Keegan yet. They know it's a preferred behavior when you start to do it as a leader.
It raises an interesting tension for me, Oscar. Whenever people join our company, I make the point of saying, you have an important voice in this company. We don't have a hierarchy here. We're interested in everybody. Use your voice and, feel free to critique, to do anything. And it offends me when people come into meetings and are just quiet for the whole meeting. I kind of have a view that, like, if you're going to come to a meeting and be silent the whole meeting, you shouldn't have come to the meeting. We've invited you here because your opinion counts. So, of course, it's the job of the facilitator to, be able to draw in the quiet voices. But isn't there equal responsibility on everyone in the meeting to use their agency and contribute and understand that they're invited there because they count? And, where do you stop kind of nannying people to draw them into the conversation and hoping people will just use their own kind of impetus to contribute constructively?
I think when we get into situations like that, we need to acknowledge that where you're at and where they're at are 2 completely different places in terms of agency. There's a power differential in everything you've just said, right? You're the boss man, I'm new. That mightn't mean anything for you, but if you're in a context where you're not the boss man and there's a power differential there, you may choose to speak up, you may not. That's okay, that's you. One of the things I would say is if you're noticing that as a pattern is maybe it's a better conversation had with that person before the meeting as a one-on-one and just notice it and just ask them, last couple of meetings, we've discussed topic A, topic B, and topic C. I'm curious if you have a perspective on that. As opposed to, hey, at the last meeting we discussed topic A, topic B, and topic C. You didn't speak up. Why not? We expect everyone to speak up here. Why aren't you speaking up? That's the same conversation, 2 very different ways. I think some people get more comfort and courage when they're asked for their opinion in smaller environments to allow them to build up at that. But, hey, I got told when I was at Microsoft, it takes a year for you to understand the complexity of the system we're in. but you have a unique perspective as an outsider to shine a light on places where we have blind spots, where we have barriers because we've been operating in this approach. And I think one of the things I would encourage again is also some people don't like group recognition. Hey, it's great you spoke up in the group. They may feel, well, as opposed to, hey, I noticed in the last meeting you made a great point. Did you notice everybody stopped and listened? Because you may not speak often, but when you do, people really pay attention. I hope you will continue to do that, or some version of that. So again, I think notice and encourage people, not necessarily in this stage of the team meeting, but how could you do that before or after the meeting to provide them with some breadcrumbs to go, did you notice when Pam spoke up today, we actually changed our approach? That's the value of speaking up. So I'm not sure any of that's useful to you, Hilton. I'm curious if there is.
Well, I think in the subtext, you're saying, use your empathy when you're encouraging people to be part of the conversation rather than critical. And, that'll go further. You want to do it with a deep sense of understanding the power differentials, you're saying, people's inhibitions, and, encouraging them from a place of compassion, not just criticism. So I definitely take that away.
And for you, Colleen?
I appreciate how you framed it, because it's interesting that Hilton gets offended because there's complexity in the room. So it is intimidating to be in a conversation with Hilton, particularly because of his knowledge and his seniority. And then also just, feeling that they may say something that would actually not make sense or come across poorly. That's going to put them in a career limiting situation. So I think that there's a lot more to it than just, they're not speaking up, therefore they're not contributing. And our team are typically quite young, and it's those individuals who struggle to also sometimes find space in the conversation, if I'm honest. There's not a lot of space always for people to speak up. So I think the way you've nuanced it is very helpful.
I mean, maybe in broadening the situation a little. This is not about, me and my team, but I often hear from senior leaders how they have wished they had spoken up more, how they often sitting in meetings thinking, should I say this? Shouldn't I say it? How's it going to go down? Am I going to be judged? Is it right? Is it wrong? All those kind of interior dialogues going on, and people feeling afterwards that they'd missed an opportunity to contribute because of whatever those inhibitions are. So, it's not, I think it's more universal than, just our team.
Yes, that's listening is situational, relational, and contextual. You've got these three very different opposing and attracting dynamics all happening. You'll listen differently to a manager than you will to a mother. You'll listen differently to a barber than you will to a builder, So there's all those dynamics happening at that time. I think the other thing that I think when we're seeking to listen in team meeting context, a lot of the time we think that just a straight verbal whatever is a great approach. Yet it could be something, and I saw a leader do this really skillfully. They just asked for a vote with a show of fingers out of 5, right? But the way she did it wasn't, I'll vote first and everybody looks around and looks at me. She went 1, 2, 3, vote, right? And so everyone voted at the same time. Now, that was a team in a high trust environment. That leader had been operating in that team for 2 years. That was a known ritual and protocol. It didn't start that way. Yet, when we want to get a read of the room, as well as where the individuals are on that range, something as simple as show of fingers or getting people to say a number out of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, whatever the case may be. I saw another leader do it with colours. which kind of shocked me. But again, it worked in their system because it made sense. They were in a creative undertaking, and they simply said, what color are you feeling about this decision right now? And they had a range of colors. But then what was fascinating is he went around the room and said, what does that color mean? So orange was an interesting color that they used. And they said, I feel like my flame is going out. It was really, really bright, but now it's orange, as opposed to you probably interpret orange as a positive, uplifting thing. And somebody said, well, I'm feeling black. And it was fascinating because then they said, I'm feeling black because now I have certainty. It's absolutely unambiguous and it's clear. So I thought, wow. So it's not just the use of sentences, dialogue, but it can be other techniques as well, but it depends where the teams are and the individuals are in their development as well.
Interesting. Hilton, do you want to bring us the next question?
So I have so many questions over here. I'm not going to my first question. I'm going to my second one. This was asked by Dr. Brian Chimsamy, who's one of our colleagues. And he says, how can one stay present and listen actively to the speaker without becoming anxious in formulating the next question they want to ask? And, it seems like there's a broader thing over here. How do I get out of my own head when I'm in a dialogue and, really listen, be with the other person instead of my own calculus of what's going on?
Yes, and with somebody who's a doctor, they're likely to have all kinds of qualifications and heuristics that they're applying to the conversation to very rapidly categorize everybody into box 1, box 2, box 3, or box 4. And in fact, we've done that with everybody in the research, and Dr. Brian would be known as the shrewd listening villain, a solution-orientated person who's ready to prescribe a solution to a diagnosis they haven't taken the time to fully undertake. They've solved 100% of every issue someone said and even the issues they haven't. We can listen continuously for 12 seconds. So it's very natural for you to want to jump ahead, to solve, to fix, to anticipate, to drift, all those things. And the reason it is because you can listen at up to 400 words per minute. On average, we can do about 250 words per minute. And as soon as that happens, our mind clicks over into its default. In Brian's case, it's solution. Back to that original question, what will make this a good conversation? It's not only a permission slip, it's also a compass setting for people like Dr. Brian. When you're going into solution mode, ask yourself these 3 questions. Does this solution serve the original question? What will make this a good conversation? Is the solution fixing a symptom or a systemic issue? So that's the second question you've got to ask yourself. Have I taken the time to fully understand the consequences and connections in what they're saying to other departments, to other divisions, to other timeframes, to other languages, to other continents, whatever the case may be? So the second question we've got to think about is are we at the symptom and are we trying to give them a headache tablet, or are they dehydrated and they just need to drink more water? That's the systemic issue. So the second question I'd ask Brian is, think about that. How deep are you going in listening to what they're saying? And then the final question to ask yourself, Brian, when you get into solutioning is, what are 3 alternatives I haven't considered that may be systemic before I come up with a solution? Because remember, they can speak at 125 words per minute. They got to get out 900. The likelihood they're going to say exactly what the problem is the first time is pretty low, 14%, maybe 20%. Maybe if you're a doctor, you'll do it in a third of the time because you're really good and structured with your language. So again, use that initial question. What will make this a good conversation as your compass setting? So is my solution helping that? Is it symptom or systemic? And have I thought about 3 alternatives? And by the way, you can think about all those 3 things before they've finished what they say and still comprehend what they're saying in front of you. So there are some gymnastics you need to do, but the point I want to make is it's normal to move into solution mode. It's one of the 4 default behaviors when it comes to listening because we speak much slower than we can listen.
Yeah, so maybe following on from that, I mean, I read into Brian's issue. Something about is there training you can do where you can be more fully present with what the other person is saying rather than, getting stuck into your own thoughts? So, I heard you say about the kind of you can listen for 12 seconds. Is there a way of, broadening that, just, getting better at it?
One of the simple techniques we talk about on our training courses is use your gaze in the triangle that's formed by the eyes to the mouth and try and keep your gaze there. But more importantly, when you see yourself drifting off or into the solutioning default or into the interrupting default, a simple technique you can use is like, what color eyes have they got? Because that's going to move yourself out of your head, out of your dialogue with yourself. And it's going to move your orientation on to the other side of the table. Now, the reason I do that is often fun with me because I've got 2 slightly different colored eyes. So when people say, Oscar, your eye color is this, I go, is it really? And they go, oh, what do you mean? I said, which eye have you looked at? And they go, oh, you've got different colored eyes. About 10% of the population, by the way, has slightly different variations in their eye color. But the point of that exercise is just get them there. Second point is this universal thing that we have called water. If you want to center yourself, the best thing to do is just grab a glass of water and drink half of it. It sends a signal to the parasympathetic nervous system to relax, to slow down, to settle down. And then the third thing to do is to simply start to notice your breathing. And just take one slightly longer breath. And more importantly, you need to inhale through your nose, not your mouth. And that will slow you down. The parasympathetic nervous system will send a great signal back to your brain to say, everything's okay. Nobody's trying to kill you. Relax. And all of a sudden, you'll be able to recenter back into the conversation. So water, breathing, and noticing something external in the face of the other person, Hilton, are 3 techniques we teach to get people out of their heads.
Thank you.
Well, that actually was the question that Silly Chatia asked exactly, which was, how do I stay present when listening? So thank you for answering Silly's question.
I'll give her a bonus tip then.
Okay, a bonus tip for Silly.
Depending on your environment, one of the quickest ways to reset your head so you're not going from back-to-back meetings or you're going from one context to another is 30 seconds of music or music with song. It doesn't have to be instrumental only, it can have voice as well, but any kind of music will, within 30 seconds, reset your wiring in your head to a completely different state. So, for example, in the book, we talk about this, that, there's effectively 3 different tempos in music. And for me, I use the different tempo in music as a setup for me. Slower tempo music, typically do when I'm working in one-on-one context, slightly upbeat context, Groove Armada. Easy is the song I use, if anybody knows them. It's a UK band, but it's light, it's breezy, it's fun. It's slightly faster than the instrumental song. And then the final one, if I've got to bring a lot of energy to the conversation, where I've got to bring the room with me, speaking on stage, for example, I'll use a song from a rapper called Fort Minor, remember the name, and that's at 180 beats per minute. And that very quickly, for me, I listen to the full songs. So, for example, Groove Armada is the energy I thought was appropriate to our conversation today. So at 10 minutes to, that's what I put on my headphones and I listen to that. And that resets me from the day to get present to what's in front of me as well. You can't do that for every meeting, but for meetings that matter, the meetings that have consequence, I would say to her, don't forget music.
Thank you. Hilton?
So an interesting question from another one of our associates, Pam Ziman. She says, and she talks about silence inside of conversations. How do we know when silence is serving the conversation versus when it's time to speak? So, I think she's talking about more intimate conversations. And, how do you sit often in silence? People want to break the silence. It's not comfortable to be in silence. And, how do you see that being used in conversations?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in the West, we have only negative language to apply to silence, the pregnant pause, the difficult silence. We have all these negative connotations to it in higher context cultures in Japan, for example, in the Inuit cultures of North America, in the indigenous cultures of the part of the world I'm in the Maori cultures and the Polynesian cultures. Silence, it's a sign of wisdom, respect, and authority. And many of their tribal gatherings start with silence rather than a welcome to bring everyone to presence. So silence has many qualities. I think in the West, one of the things we consistently do is go, oh, silence is bad and I'm busting to speak and I've got to get in here. And do we know another way? Is another way possible? So a couple of simple frameworks around silence is think about silence as a way to help everyone present to explore those 900 words. Silent and listen have the same letters. They're just moved around a little bit. So there's a little clue in there. But to the specific question about is silence serving or is silence intimidating? So I've seen in in board meetings, particularly with the clients I work with, when executives come in, a person posing a question may strategically use silence before they complete their sentence. To that person, that may be incredibly intimidating. We need to be careful with our use of silence. So silence done well is in service. So I would say back to those initial compass settings, Pam, is silence serving where the conversation is at now? Is silence serving the agreed place of where the whole conversation needs to go? And is silence helping that person get the 900 words out? And only Pam can make that informed choice in the moment in that intimate conversation. So Pam needs to kind of simultaneously adopt a couple of positions there to understand if silence is serving. As a general rule, when we work with our clients and in training sessions, err on the side of more silence rather than extended silence. What I mean by that, if you usually have little silence in between a dialogue, then just add 1 second on. Don't add 10 seconds on. Don't add 30 seconds on. That's going to come across as weird and confusing to the person you're in dialogue with. But if 1 second extra works, then next week just add it to 2 seconds. You will be surprised what you hear when you continue to extend that out. Eventually, some people will notice and they'll comment on that back to you. So Pam, is it in service of the dialogue agreement originally, so it's where the conversation's going as well. In that moment, just extend it for 1% more. If you're a 10-second silence person, I'll just take it to 11.
Thank you.
Okay, we are looking now at Dr. Neville Golden's question, which is, what is the difference between hearing and listening?
Good question. And before we get to Neville's question, we're about 60% into our conversation. How are we tracking overall? What have we learned from the last hour that could improve the outcome for those listening right now? We're just going to have a little commercial break between Hilton and Colleen and myself. This is a technique I use with the leaders I work with as a way, well, I'll tell you what its purpose is once we conclude the conversation. So we'll go Colleen first and Hilton second. We've covered a lot of ground already. How can we use the remaining time to be really effective for those who are listening? And what do you recommend I need to change in the way I communicate with you or with them?
Oscar, I think we're on track. I feel that the questions we're asking are clear. We're not making a lot of duplication in what we're speaking about, so it's very engaging. And I think the way you're communicating is also just on point, giving us lots of examples and practical ways that we can improve. I guess to use the best, the last part of our time is maybe to try to get the last few questions in, so maybe to just be mindful of the time. But so far, the thing that's contributed, you mentioned what's contributed, what am I taking away, is just the pace has slowed down a lot, which is actually very helpful. I'm just much more aware of how you've, taken the conversation to a much calmer place, and I'm enjoying that pace a lot.
Hilton.
Yeah. I think you've definitely helped me do some deep thinking about listening and, really just understanding the complexity of it. And yeah, I agree with Colleen. I think you've helped create a good cadence around the conversation, and it's got a nice rhythmic appeal, and it sounds like it's very carefully, it's done with intention. Often people speak so fast that you're not sure how they formulate it. It's like they're running ahead of themselves, and it feels like everything's very carefully considered in the way that you said. Now, a lot of that is your experience. You're not saying these things for the first time, but it definitely brings a good measure to it. So I'm enjoying the pace of it, and what I've learned is it's a good thing to slow down conversations and get them into a rhythm of comfort for the people around you. And that, really serves, I think, the way the conversation flows. So, yeah, that's been a good learning for me.
Thank you. Now, the technique we've just used, you can use in any team meeting, in any one-on-one meeting, and it's crucial you do it with enough time to make the adjustment. If you're a leader who's struggling, and here's what I didn't tell you at the beginning, if you're a leader who's struggling and go, my team doesn't speak up and I never get feedback because I say to the team, hey, could you give me feedback on how we're going? They're not going to give you feedback. As opposed to what we just did now, what worked, what needs improvement, and how can we make that adjustment visible so we can signal back to our team that I'm listening to you and I will adjust for the balance of the meeting. And one of the things I was really conscious of is my ramble to concision ratio, given Hilton's initial comments about what frustrates him. And Colleen references as cadence, and also Hilton's picked it up as cadence. So real time, when I heard that, I've also adjusted how I communicate to go, okay, Hilton's a proxy for the audience. So how do I flex and show both styles So, for example, that story about Tracy at the beginning was probably the 4-minute version of that story. But I can also do a 10-minute version of that story, and I can also do a 30-second version of that story. I sensed initially that maybe the 4-minute version would serve the group to give a lot more context. So let's go back to the initial or the remaining questions that we have, and notice if my cadence changes for the balance of the meeting.
Great. So that's for Neville. We've got Neville's question up next, which is, what is the difference between hearing and listening?
Yeah, so hearing is simply an auditory process. It means you're hearing sound waves, they're going into your ear, getting to your brain via the cochlea. The brain turns it into electronic signals and you hear things. You can hear a bus go by, you can hear a police car go by, you can hear a human talking. Listening is making sense of what is said, and deep listening is helping them make sense of what they've said. So I'll build on that. So a lot of people talk about listening and active listening. That means I can comprehend what they've just articulated. That's handy, but it doesn't help the speaker. When we know that they speak so much slower than they think, our job is to get them to say what they mean, not for us, but for them. And when they say what they mean, you'll get more discretionary effort from them. They feel a higher sense of agency. They feel a greater sense of belonging to the workplace. And they believe that the social group that they belong to in that enterprise is a social group worth risking things for to give additional effort. So, Neville, hearing is just the sounds. Listening is comprehending, and deep listening is helping them make sense of what they actually mean.
So, Oscar, is it okay to ask an impromptu question that I've just been thinking of while we've been going along?
Is the question in service of the audience?
I think so.
Okay.
But you'll tell me if it's not. So I'm a scientist, a social scientist, so not a proper scientist. I'm a social scientist. And I have an idea for a completely impractical experiment that I would love to conduct. And the experiment would work like this. You would take 100 kids who are 6 or 7 years old. And for the next 3 or 4 years, you would teach them the pragmatics of listening. You would put them in, they would have a normal curriculum, but one of their subjects would be how to listen, how to reflect, how to explore, all the kind of things that we don't learn. You take these 100 kids and you do this foundational training on listening. So you make them, whatever, your best to make them expert listeners and from an early age. You've got a control group that doesn't do any of that. And then you measure those people 20 years, say 10 years later, right? They get to their mid-20s. And you want to notice if there's differences around how their lives have gone. My question to you is, would you expect to find that the experimental group would have had advantages in life from the early training in listening compared to the control group?
This is complete speculation on my part.
Yes, sure.
I think anybody at that age group that gets any extra training, be that in coding software, be that in poetry, be that in swimming, they will have life experiences that are very different to the control group. Whether they're advantageous or not, I would struggle to kind of say there's a correlation there. I sense, though, that when it comes to perspective creating and emotional regulation, because you mentioned like 7, I'm thinking of my 7-year-old twin, grandson and granddaughter. I don't try that social experiment on them because I'm too busy listening to my wife saying, "You're not listening to me," meaning to the grandkids aren't listening to her. But I speculate any additional investment will create perspectives and opportunities that the control group may not necessarily have.
Yeah. So, essentially we're saying, does the life skill of being an excellent listener give you an advantage in life?
Well, when I think about the judges and the journalists and the air traffic controllers and all the people we've done deep dive interviews with, for them, it absolutely create very, very different experiences in life. Whether they're advantageous or not, not sure I'm the right person to judge there. But this is a question. Earlier on I talked about symptoms versus systems. I should and could stop all my work and just concentrate on the educational system because there is limited training on listening. But the most conservative system in the world is the education system. Mm-hmm. And it would take me the best part of 2 decades to create the conditions of the experiments that you've talked about, because I've been approached by educational institutions in Ireland, in Japan, in New Zealand, in France, all wanting to embed this into their system. And I said, look, the way the pedagogy works and the way the evidence needs, and all I say to them is, I would rather work with your teachers and have the impact through them than trying to get that systemic impact happening, because literally I don't have enough time on the earth to do the other thing. What I have done, though, is there's a special interest group in our deep listening ambassador community where I've joined all those people up from Japan and from Ireland and from France and from New Zealand together, who are educators who have taken the 5 levels of listening and simplified them for students. So it's not a controlled experiment. It's very much a practitioner's approach from their point of view. Students who listen better probably answer the question they're reading better in exams than students who don't, would be my final, very pragmatic thing to say about listening and students. And thanks for your impromptu question.
Okay, Hilton, stick to the script now. Let's finish our questions.
We have been told.
Do you have another one, Hilton?
I have one from my daughter, Atara. And Atara says, what is the hardest thing about listening, and what do you do to remedy this?
Yeah. So the hardest thing about listening is explaining to everybody that listening does not start by focusing on the speaker. That is the wrong place to start your listening. Listening starts by you closing down all the browser tabs in your mind to get ready for the conversation so you can listen. So the hardest part of listening is hearing a whole bunch of unfounded anecdotes that says, focus on the speaker, notice what they say, nod and confirm and say, aha, and all those things. You're not listening. The first person you need to listen to is yourself, and you do not have the available cognitive capacity to listen if you've got a whole bunch of noise going on in your mind before you come to the conversation. So the hardest part of listening is listening to yourself.
Okay.
Oscar, how are we doing for time? Are you comfortable for the last? I've got 2 more questions. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got
Okay.
lots of time set aside.
Okay. So this question comes from Tyra Shea, who works in our team. Her question is, as the OD team, we're often quick to jump to helping or solving a client's problem. What are some listening tips that would help us avoid solutioning too early? And how do we catch ourselves in the moment and reset back to true listening?
This problem's endemic for any service provider in an organization, whether that's HR, finance, technology, even sales. Before you solution, have you asked this question? How long have you been thinking about this issue? That will provide you a moment to let them say, oh, I've been thinking about it for 5 minutes. I've been thinking about it for 5 weeks. I've been thinking about it for 5 years. Because the solutioning you come back with someone who's been thinking about it for 5 weeks is going to be very different for the solutioning somebody's thought about it for 5 minutes. So the first question I would encourage all those support functions to do when somebody comes to them with a problem is, how long has this been an issue, or how long have you been thinking about this issue? That will allow you to calibrate really, really quickly. The next thing is, if you're getting into solutioning, have you provided a framework for the other person to think through their problem? So, an example of a framework might be, tell me when it's not true. Because people come and say, oh, the customers always complain about this issue. Okay, so a simple framework is offer them the opposite. And they go, well, it's not always, but in these conditions. So you've given them a really simple framework to double click on their thinking to the next level. A framework might be, what's a quick solution? What's a complex solution? And what's a permanent solution? And get them to think through all 3 of those. If you offer them frameworks, you're still assisting in solutioning and you're giving yourself time to jump into the problem. Not enough providers of support functions provide frameworks when it comes to what they're trying to serve in their clients' outcomes. So, we can never get well-qualified candidates. Well, never is an interesting keyword to think about. I think about whenever they use absolutes. When is this not true? And they'll kind of have to flip their mind really quickly and go, well, actually, it's not true in these cases. Okay, is that part of a short-term, medium-term, or permanent solution? Oh, well, okay. And then step them through whatever. Frameworks are your friend when you're in solution mode. Frameworks help them expose their thinking and yours. And you'll get to a different and possibly more sustainable outcome than your original heuristic that jumped ahead and said, the answer to this is blank.
Thank you. Oscar, my last 2 questions I'm going to put into one. So the one was, how do cultural differences affect our listening? And then the other question was similar. We listen through individual filters shaped by our backgrounds, history, and education. What are some of the methods we can use, especially during conflict, to listen beyond those filters?
So again, I will go back to the conversation compass at the beginning. No matter what my cultural background is, no matter what my language background is, getting them to enunciate what will make this a good conversation is crucial. I was working with somebody who was had 3 languages, and we were having a conversation in their non-preferred language, which was English, and I asked a question, and I could see they were struggling, and I said, say it in Hebrew, because that was their home language. And they looked at me completely confused. I said, please. And they said it in Hebrew, and you could see the shift immediately in their thinking. And I've done the same with people in Spanish and in French, and it's very universally consistent, because straight away they went from Hebrew into English and said, in English, this means, but they couldn't say it the first time. So you need to have enough of a cultural radar to know that somebody's cultural background and the language of business may not be the most comfortable or the widest range of language they speak into. It's okay to get them to say it in their home language, as an example. Why am I doing that? I don't care what they say. I'm trying to help them listen to how they're thinking. And they're thinking in their home language, or they're thinking in their home culture. So a version of that would be, how would this work in the Philippines? Because it was in a context of Singapore, and they were from the Philippines. And they said, well, in the Philippines, and they went on and explained it. And I go, great. And I stopped, and they said, we don't have to do it exactly the same way they do it in Singapore, do we? I said, well, that's up to you. Which bit are you going to take from the Philippines and which bit are you going to take from Singapore? So I think that also requires you to have a very clear understanding of your culture, of your lenses, of your biases, because in that moment when I was working with a person with a home language, for example, in Spanish, they were struggling with a very significant conflict at work. And they were struggling to say what they felt, and they were struggling to say what they mean. And when I said, just say it in Spanish because I won't understand it, you could see this weight lifted off them, their energy and their body shape changed completely. And away we went. And they must have spoken in Spanish for about 6 minutes. But you could feel the venom eventually go out of the conversation. And they said, oh, I feel so much better now I've said it. I said, where does this need to go to now with that person? And they said, I now have the courage to say it in English. I said, okay, great. Anything else? And they went, no, we can cut this meeting short. So a 1 hour meeting was 20 minutes. So done well, listening across cultural contexts can shorten things rather than lengthen them as well.
Well, I suppose culture could, in some way get in the way if you're in a conversation with someone from a culture where contradicting authority is seen as taboo, and you want to have an open dialogue, you bump heads with their whole history of being more restrained in that situation.
Yeah, you need to know your culture first to go, in my culture, that's okay. Is it okay in their culture? And a lot of the times we need to make the implicit explicit in those dialogue. So again, working with someone who was in a EMEA HQ out of Brussels, they were very frustrated with the lack of, this might sound familiar, Hilton. Whenever I'm engaging with the people in Asia, I never hear anything. They never contribute. It's only the Australians that speak up, right? The Japanese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, they don't speak up. Occasionally an Indian might speak up. I simply said to them, okay. And they were Dutch. You won't be surprised because the Dutch are famous for being direct and very specific. And I said, how much of that culture do you understand? And it's ironic that some of the deepest work historically across cultures has been done by a Dutchman, Hofstadter. And I said, have you taken the time to build relationships? Because they're high context cultures. What do I need to build a relationship for? I just need answers. I said, well, how's that going for you right now? And all of a sudden he went, he says, does that mean I have to go to Japan? Does that mean I have to go to Korea? I said, I don't know. What's it worth to you? I said, maybe start simple. Maybe send them a postcard, something tangible to show them. And he said, I will send them a postcard of my family and I skiing. It's like, okay. Just that one little thing, all of a sudden started to peel the onion and build a relationship that he'd never considered before. So, there's a big cost in our global society where people have their own filters on. And it's incumbent on people who've worked across cultures successfully to help put different mirrors in front of them so they realize there's maybe a different way.
Right.
Hilton, can you mention the names of the people whose questions you read, please, just for...
So that hybrid question came from Coral and from Anne.
Okay, great.
Both. Thank you.
Okay. Final question is from Dr. Cliff Lewis. Which of your own thoughts, Oscar, or emotions do you feel you need to resist most in order to truly listen?
I'm a solution machine. All right. So if I take my own assessment, I'm lost at home and I'm a shrewd listener at work. I will get onto briefing calls where somebody will go, we've struggled with our employee engagement survey and the staff don't feel like, and I'm going, yeah. I bet you don't have an action plan. I bet you haven't actioned anything. I bet you haven't even told them the results of the last survey. I bet you the organization hasn't even engaged the team in question formulation because they're pulling an off-the-shelf solution because they've got this fantasy about industry benchmarks. And if you talk to any anthropologist, and I've interviewed 12 of them, this is what's going on in my head, Colleen. And I have to practice what I preach. And it's like looking at their eyes, taking a drink of water. Oscar, have you got a framework to help them think through this? Because the framework is going to be your friend here. And but I'm human. I spent my lifetime in solution mode, and that's what I struggle with the most. When it comes to feelings, I grew up in a family with significant parental conflict. So, I'm the connector. I'm forever trying to connect people together to help people progress their conflicts. So that would be on the feeling side of the question, because I think there was two parts in that question. P.S. Good questions don't have two parts. They have 8 words or less, and they're very specific, but that's a story for another day.
Well, thank you so much, Oscar. Maybe just to wrap up round as we end the podcast. Hilton, anything from your side?
Well, yeah, maybe just in summary, it's been very informative listening to Oscar and getting real combination of personal insights, I think techniques, and also your own vulnerabilities. It's good to hear that you're human, Oscar, and I'm sure people are coming to you. People are coming to you with, they're coming to you with questions. So, being in solution mode is, that's not unnatural for you. That's what, people are coming. They're coming to get that from you. And you have to slow it down and let them do the work of finding solutions that are meaningful for them, which is, I think, your art of listening.
Yeah, and I think the ironic thing was, with the Deep Listening Ambassador community, we're on a quest for 100 million deep listeners in the workplace. And about 10 years ago, a good friend, Dan, said to me, hey, Oscar, you realize you can't listen your way to 100 million deep listeners. You're going to have to become a very good speaker. You're going to have to write books. You're going to have to get really good at many-to-one, because one-on-one, you're awesome, but you suck at bigger scale. And for you to be successful, you're going to have to get really uncomfortable and get good at speaking. You're going to have really good data and really good stories. you're going to have to be able to tell the 30-second version of it and the 3-minute version of it.
Mhm.
So, what's one thing that you may have changed your mind on, Hilton, when it comes to listening?
What's one thing that I changed my mind on? I think I've changed my mind on the idea that, the way that I was trained in listening, which was a very therapeutic, reflective way, is not the only way. I mean, I think, you use frameworks a lot for the way that you conduct your listening workshops. And I don't have those kind of handholds. I have like my own formula of reflective listening. And so I've learned that I've really got to broaden my skills in that area.
Okay. Well, if there's anything I can do to help add some tools in your kit bag, let me know. I keep saying to people, too many people think listening at work is therapy and you are completely unqualified to practice. And so much malpractice takes place in the workplace because they think it looks like somebody sitting on a couch, and they listen for too long. They use too much silence, and there are a lot of the people we're trying to help along. Colleen, what about for you? What's different in your thinking compared to when we started?
There's so many things that I've learned. I think the thing that sits with me quite deeply is what you said about allowing people to hear themselves, so that it's not just about me listening, but it's around finding ways for them to hear themselves, and especially around language. I thought that discussion where the individual just spoke in Spanish was just incredible. So, but many, many things, Oscar. Thank you so much. I leave very different than when I started the conversation with you.
Well, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Great. What a powerful reminder that listening isn't passive. It's an intentional act that transforms how we connect, lead, and collaborate. A huge thank you to Oscar Trimboli for sharing his wisdom, and to our Omnicor community for the thoughtful questions that shaped this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone who values meaningful conversation, and follow the Omnicor podcasts for more insights and explore the people inside of business. I'm Colleen McClintock with Hilton Rudnick. Thanks for joining us, and remember, keep listening deeply.